Hey there guys, it's me TheTacticalBrit, your home of breakdowns, in-depth guides, and everything in between. Now today I want to talk about something that I call the battlefield problem. And I'm sure a lot of you guys who are veterans of the franchise will understand what I'm getting at pretty soon. But this is a problem that I find to be unique to the Battlefield franchise, and I feel as though it's something worth discussing because it does come up a lot, and I think we're really seeing it again here in Battlefield 5, especially with the impending release of the Pacific Theater. So let's dive into this. Something I find in every Battlefield game is a glimmer of brilliance. Now, whether that's something that shines immediately or takes a little while to show, I feel as though it's something that we all appreciate about the franchise. In Battlefield 4, it was this really great sandbox, this environment where anything could happen and you could play 100 games of Conquest and 200 different things would occur, and that was really special. In Battlefield 3, it was this superior gunplay dynamic and the atmosphere that the game created. It was one of the first real, for me, in-depth multiplayer military shooters of a grand scale. Now yes, we did have Battlefield 2 back in the day, but I feel as though this was a newer generation. This was, the consoles are out, this was everybody's online nowadays playing, and it's no longer just a small minority. And then you sort of flash back and all of them had these things. Battlefield Bad Company 2 had superior infantry gameplay and also some of the greatest transport vehicle use I think I've seen in any games. And then you kind of look around and each Battlefield game has something. Battlefield 1 created great atmospheres of warfare environment, and then Battlefield 5 has some excellent gunplay mechanics, as well as some of the best movement mechanics of any Battlefield game ever. And you really look around and each individual one had something that made them special. And each individual one had something that I think I can point to, at least, that I can say I really did like and appreciate about the game. Even if you look at Battlefield Hardline, which has always had a questionable place in the Battlefield theatre, that was a game that released with a relatively stable launch, tried something a bit different, had some great features like Gun Bench, and really went the extra mile in a lot of areas. And I just think that maybe because of the setting, it didn't get the attention it deserved. But ultimately, again, you look around, each individual game had something that made it shine in a way that we all individually found special. But this is where the Battlefield problem arises. And the Battlefield problem for me breaks down into 2 points. The first one for me is, why is it that every game that releases seemingly takes so long to come good? This is something we've seen time and time and again, and I think we're even witnessing it right now with Battlefield 5. And the next big issue for me is, why are none of these lessons learned from previous Battlefield games, and why don't we bring their feature sets forward into a future title to create the best and most complete Battlefield experience we could possibly have? So let's start with point 1. Well, it's pretty self-evident that most Battlefield games, almost like a really weird and kind of shitty fine wine, take a while to improve. Now, every Battlefield game sort of takes, I would estimate maybe 6 to 8 months before it comes good. Battlefield 4 I don't think you could recommend within the first 9 months of it releasing. Battlefield 1, yes, it did have some issues, but it wasn't exactly perfect for a couple of months. I think it really started to refine itself after the Russian DLC. And then if you look at games like Battlefield 3 that had some serious balancing issues for the first few months, and then, you know, even more as you look back, there's just a sporadic bounce of in-between of issues that did occur. I think, ironically, Battlefield Hardline was probably the closest the game got to a game that released as it was, didn't really have an overarching issue, but just improved and refined as it went along. And I feel like right now, Battlefield 4 is very much in my mind because Battlefield 5 is taking the similar route. In fact, to some degree, I'd actually say that Battlefield 5 is being almost an extreme version of Battlefield 4. You couldn't really recommend 4 between about 6 to 9 months after it released. Even the Naval Strike DLC plagued the game with problems for an extended period of time, to the point where it was even pretty unplayable on a lot of systems, including PlayStation 4. But then, if you kind of flash forward a bit, it did go really well. Eventually, the game sort of kicked off the bugs it had, and it felt like a lot of people were enjoying Battlefield 4. And it kind of concerns me in the sense that I feel like we actually lost a good number of people in that gap where, you know, the game wasn't in a great way, and it took a really long time to get them to come back. Now, if you look at Battlefield 5, this is potentially taking a whole year. Now, the game hasn't necessarily been terrible, but first, I don't know, 3 or 4 months were a pretty good period for the game. You know, it did have some issues, but it felt like they were being worked on or at least fixed relatively quickly, and stability-wise and in terms of bugs and performance, things felt smooth, things felt really great. In fact, the Battlefield beta even reminds me of a time where I felt the game was actually in a pretty good place. And then all of a sudden, a couple of months later, things have gone really downhill. And that first 3 or so, 2 to 3 months progress has almost completely vanished because nobody remembers what the game used to be like. People play what it is right now. So suddenly we find ourselves in a scenario where the game went from really decent to really bad to, well, just a drought. This whole summer has been a complete loss for words for me because nothing has happened, nothing's been improved, and the bugs and patches that we're expecting to be fixed and things that are expecting to come out are being steadily more and more delayed. And I call this an extreme version of Battlefield 4 because it appears as though by the time these bugs are resolved, and by the time we actually have a revival of the game, will be the Pacific Theater, which is around about a year since the game released. A whole year where you could say that Battlefield 5 is in a really good place, here's the Pacific, you should come and try it. And what's mental about that is that I just don't understand how this Battlefield issue keeps reoccurring, how so many different times, so many different ways, the game finds a way to falter itself for the first couple of months. But I do have some theories behind it. Every year we're seeing what appears to be some kind of innovation, and that innovation is clearly taking up the chunk of development time. And I feel as though a lot of the stuff that we previously had in the game that worked or was working well kind of gets thrown out the window, a new drawing board is laid down, and here we go. I feel like Battlefield 3 and 4 are quite difficult to differentiate because they are very similar, but you can really see that formula coming in Hardline 1 and 5 to the extent that basically right now you couldn't really liken Battlefield 5 to the previous generations of games because so much has drastically changed about how they work and what they do. Now that's not to say that innovation is bad, but really if it comes at the cost of a decent service of the game at a regular basis, or if it comes at the cost of the game releasing in a bad way, like we saw with Battlefield 4, then we need to start thinking about the game going on hiatus. Put it for 2 to 3 years. Give the game developers 3 or 4 years, 2 to 3 years, however they feel comfortable with, to release things. Give them time, necessary time to build something that is both impressive and ready from the jump. You know, we want a Battlefield game that's got RSP. We want a Battlefield game that has the features we anticipate for a Battlefield game. And stuff that just shouldn't be half-cooked. I wouldn't touch co-op with a fucking barge pole in Battlefield 5. It's just not enjoyable. I don't think a lot of people would play some of the dynamics and stuff that's been put into the game. I really do feel as though it just is a matter of giving that extra time to really refine something. Battlefield 5 was in a decent way when it released, but it just needed those extra few months, maybe that extra year or so, to get everything finalized so that when the game released it was in such a good way the developers could simply work on new things that would make it an impressive state of affairs. Because if you look across the water to Battlefront 2, that's actually where they finally got to. It took them a really long time, but that's where they got to. And I'm saying rather than us getting to the got to point, let's just be there from the start. And part of this is the second part of the problem that I mentioned. I really feel as though Battlefield does have standout features that we learn about. If I were to just name them from the get-go, Battlefield Bad Company 2, great layouts, great infantry gameplay, really good transport vehicle use. Battlefield 3, superior gunplay, really good DLC structures, themed mag DLC worked a treat. Battlefield 4, fantastic ecosystem of like a whole sandbox environment, a great ecosystem of how vehicles, people, and aerial vehicles all interact with one another. Battlefield 1, a great wartime setting. No Battlefield game has ever had that feeling of ambience, has never had that ability to create something like grand operations, which adds such a layer of immersion to the game. If I were to think about Battlefield Hardline, I'd say, well, this is a refined release. This was a game that did some things a little bit differently, but also introduced some fantastic features like Gun Bench, which shouldn't have been forgotten about. And then if we move forward, Battlefield 5, fantastic gunplay, a really great movement system that's simply just being marred by bugs and inconsistencies and some issues we've had. And I really kind of think about this because I feel as though you can look at all these games and conjure up so many things you've learned about the player base of Battlefield that you could make, in theory, a Battlefield that is as close to perfect as you could get. Now, the biggest issue I find, and the biggest one I like to point to, is anti-material rifles and MMGs. Now, If you were to flash back to Battlefield 4, I would personally argue that something like an MMG or an anti-material rifle would have been a pickup weapon. It wouldn't have been something that you actually could have used in a loadout. Why? Because everybody feels like they're cheap kills. MMGs and anti-material rifles feel like cheap kills in Battlefield. And I really feel as though those were the cheap weapons that we found as pickup weapons that weren't that big an issue because you rarely had any issues with them. And suddenly I feel as though you can kind of connotate any talking point to the current games or previous games and go, well, this is what a different game did that people kind of learned and liked, so this is what we should be doing. I really do think it is to some degree that simple. From a development standpoint, of course, there are so many layers to it, but if you're just talking conceptually and executing a concept, I feel as though there's just so much to learn from the rich history of Battlefield. So guys, let me know what you think about Battlefield right now. What is next for this franchise? What is going to happen? Where should we be going? Let me know what you think in the comment section below. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you again soon in another video.